As Old as Time, Part 2. Ask the Dishes. By the time she was done cleaning, Belle was beyond exhausted and all alone in the silent kitchen. The stove seemed to be asleep, frozen in his unlit off position. The furniture was also hushed, or otherwise unmoving. For the first time in the haunted castle, Belle began to feel lonely. Not scared or desperate for some other sign of life, but just lonely for companionship. Things had seemed to be going so well with the beast. What had set him off so dramatically? She peeked into the servants' dining hall. To her relief, most of the senior house staff and some of the more prominent junior staff were sitting around the table, enjoying the large blanketed fire at the end of the room. Mrs. Potts, Lumiere, and Cogsworth sat together at the head. The rake, presumably the former gardener, and the shaving strop were playing a game of cards. Dustmaids and the parasol gossip. "Hello?" Belle ventured. They all immediately stopped what they were doing and looked over at her. "Oh, child, is your dinner over already?" Mrs. Potts asked in concern. "I think I pushed him too far," Belle said wearily. She indicated an empty chair. "May I?" "It's highly—" Cogsworth began. "Yes, of course," Lumiere interrupted, leaping down and pulling it out for her. Belle sank into the chair gratefully. "Apparently, I just rush into things. Totally not like my mother. Rushing to curse someone, rushing into a creepy castle. Totally not the same thing at all. I may as well apologize to all of you right now. If you haven't heard yet, it turns out my mother was the one who cursed your master and all of you. And of course, it's me who brought the curse to fruition. I am so very, very sorry." Those who knew at least some of it already, like Lumiere and Cogsworth, studiously didn't react. The rest dropped everything in shock. "I feel terrible. I can't even describe how sorry I am. I didn't realize when I first came here that you were all human once. I thought maybe you were just things that were animated to life." "I am a Christian," Cogsworth said indignantly. He pronounced it Christian. "A man with a soul, trapped in this unforgivable clockwork prison." "Oh, I'd say it's fairly forgiving of some of your less attractive features," Lumiere said casually. "We were all people once," Mrs. Potts said sadly. "Even my boy Chip. He was just a lad when it all happened, and he still is for all these years. Maybe in its own way, that's a blessing." "So you're the great enchantress's daughter," Cogsworth said thoughtfully. "I find it very odd that you come back here." "Magic always comes back on itself," Mrs. Potts clucked. There were general murmurs of agreement and nodding of head-like appendages around the table. "What?" Belle asked. "Oh, it's just something Mr. Potts used to say," she said, shaking her spout. "Every curse, every charm, every little bit of kitchen magic comes from somewhere and doesn't go away when it's finished. There's always a price to pay, and it usually involves the one who casts the spell." "Was he an enchanter?" Belle asked politely. "Him? No," Mrs. Potts chuckled. "He wasn't one of les charmans. His only magic was with animals, and it wasn't magic, if you know what I mean." "Wait. Les charmans?" Belle pressed, suddenly alert. "What are those?" "It's just a general term," Lumiere explained with a candle-like shrug. "It means anyone just a little bit touched by magic." "Could be the ears and tail of a wolf," Mrs. Potts said. "Could be a tendency to float rather than walk. Could be a great enchantress, a kitchen witch, or that strange little girl at the market who never aged and always had those lovely mushrooms in the fall." "Fairies," Belle said in wonder, remembering what the beast had said. "Les charmans. They lived here." "We were famous for it," Cogsworth said with a sniff of pride. "At one time." "So, my mother was one of those charmans?" Belle said slowly. "That funny mark next to where my mother's name would have been in the record book. I wonder if that's what it meant. Did the kingdom keep track of les charmans?" Everyone looked a little uncomfortable. "Not officially," Cogsworth said delicately. "All minority groups have had good and bad relations with the crown at different times in history. This particular reign was not over-thrilled, with the idea of people with potentially greater strength and power than their own soldiers. Belle racked her brain for other names that had this symbol next to them. Have you heard of Giard? Francois Giard? Everyone looked blank. Amy Dupree? The little objects gave various versions of shrugs as their anatomy followed. Christophe Lambert? Werewolf, Lumiere said immediately. Several other people around the table nodded. And what a drinker! The whole family was a bit touched. With drinking, I mean. Mostly harmless, except for the time with the sheep. He tended to go on a spree before the full moon and then decamp to the hills. It was quite a sight some nights. I wonder what happened to him, the old gardener said. You used to hear his howls. Some hated it, but I thought they were rather lovely. Forlorn and magical, like the old days. Oh, they were all mostly gone by the 3rd year of the fever, the shaving straw added. That was a bad time, Mrs. Potts said, shuddering. I was in bed for a month, do you remember? And I was one of the lucky ones. A fever so high you'd like us to burn your thumb feeling a patient's forehead, and just wasting away with a terrible shallow breathing. Less than half the kingdom was left when it was over, Cogsworth added bleakly. It ran us through. Didn't matter if you were a peasant or a king or a queen. Belle's throat went dry. King or queen? Yes, it took both of them. Poor things, Mrs. Potts said, clucking. Left the master an orphan at age 10. Oh my God. Belle rubbed her face with her hands, feeling panicky and nauseated. The plague killed him. That's why he was so upset and rushed out. And there I was, just chattering along about what terrible people they were for not helping. I am an idiot. I am such an idiot. I need to go find him and apologize. She started to get up. Don't bother, Lumiere said gently, grasping at her sleeve. If he's in one of his fits, it would just be best to leave him alone until he calms down. Wait until tomorrow morning, dear, Mrs. Potts said, nodding. It's for the best. Belle reluctantly sat back down. Research, ask, investigate, she told herself. That's what you are here to do, so do it. All right. But you said there was almost no charmans left by the end. The records tend to indicate that it wasn't the fever. Ah, none, the dustmaid spoke up. It didn't touch them at all, because it was started by them. It was started by a witch. Pish and nonsense, Mrs. Potts said. You have no idea what you're talking about, child. It was a terrible, deadly disease, plain and simple, Cogsworth added firmly. There was nothing magical about it. It didn't discriminate in its victims. So what happened to them? Belle pressed. Suddenly the room grew very quiet. The objects became still, only Lumiere's flames flickering and Cogsworth's dial ticking. Look, I think it might have something to do with breaking the curse, Belle said, pleading. I think it might have to do with my mother's leaving us or disappearing. I really think she's trying to tell me something, but if we're going to try it all, you need to tell me. Besides, our king and queen, not everyone, liked les charmans, Mrs. Potts said slowly. For obvious reasons, the dustmaid said with a snort, indicating everyone in the room. There's always been tension in the principality, as I said, Cogsworth put in primly. Usually everyone got on all right, but there have been periods when people were on worse behavior than usual, let us say. Right before the curse was one of those periods. There was an incident involving the death of a normal boy at the hands of one of les charmans. Violence ensued. Many people already believed les charmans were the cause of all the trouble in the kingdom. Whenever there was a drought, or a crop failure, or livestock weren't breeding, or a plague, the dustmate put in icily. Some said they were leaving, going back to the fair lands, or wherever they came from, Mrs. Potts said with a sigh. But in reality, they were probably being disappeared. One week you'd hear of a good wife being beaten half to death, and the next week the nice man with the claws who sold the lovely China silk would be gone. Just gone, nothing else missing. It doesn't take a lot of guessing to figure out what probably happened. If you weren't a charman, there was nothing to fear, the dustmaid pointed out. That's foolishness, Mrs. Potts said. Think of Mr. Potts. He went the way of all the rest of them did, and he wasn't magic. Bah, the dustmate said. You prove my point. He was well known for his views. If he wasn't so friendly to those freaks of nature, maybe he would be fine. And do not forget that it was one of Les Charmans who cursed you, who cursed all of us. You see how they were all insane and powerful? How can you forgive them? It was one person, Cogsworth said patiently, who had to watch as her people were harassed and hunted down. In her own twisted way, she was doing what she thought was right to protect them and save what was the rest of the kingdom, and you could not blame an entire group of the actions of one. But we are all charmans now, Lumiere said, pounding a brass fist at the table. It was the first time Belle had seen serious, strong emotion in what seemed like an otherwise laid-back little guy. It doesn't matter anymore. It's just as well as the rest of the world has forgotten about us, because if they hadn't people who would swoop in and kill us for being tainted by the devil or lock us up in a circus. All the creatures looked around at each other, and then at the ground awkwardly after his outburst. I don't understand, Belle said, resting her weary head on her hands. No one in the village where I grew up even believes in magic. The village right over there, across the river, from all this. And my mother disappeared after we moved there, so it couldn't have been some sort of witch hunt, right? It's a lot to take in for one night, Mrs. Potts said kindly, waddling forward. She seemed tired, just moving took effort. I think maybe we should all retire, Lumiere suggested, trying to sound like his old self again. All the spoons, cups, mops, garden equipment, and assorted animated household things clipped and clanked and clopped stiffly down from the table onto the chairs and finally to the floor. Some of them weren't moving too well at all. One of the spoons seemed so sleepy and stiff that she had to be carried by her friends. Belle wondered about that, but then Cogsworth's face chimed. It was late. They were probably just tired and didn't show it in the way normal people did. Maybe, like Cinderella, the magic changed at midnight. I just have a few more dishes, Belle said, also getting up. Leave it, dear, Mrs. Potts said. We'll deal with it fresh and early in the morning. But the whole point was to give you all a night off, Belle protested. You've done enough. I mean that sincerely, the teapot said, turning this way and that, but keeping her spout directed at Belle. The gesture seemed to be the equivalent of a knowing smile. You've done more to bring life and change into these walls than anything has in the past 10 years. Belle's look turned dark. I wonder if maybe your whole kingdom was cursed long before my mother showed up. Disease, ethnic cleansing, a king and queen who didn't care for their people. Mrs. Potts sighed. It wasn't always like that. It used to be quite a magical place, in all senses of the word. Well. She struggled to waddle her way to the edge of the table, the end of the parade of creatures retreating back to the kitchen. With some alarm, Belle reacted before she thought, gently picking up Mrs. Potts and setting her on the floor. She wasn't sure if it was breaking some sort of unspoken code among the curse, but it just felt right. Mrs. Potts felt warm but unmoving in her hand, just like a real normal teapot. If it weren't for the twitch of her spout, Belle would have never known she was anything but. Thank you, my dear, Mrs. Potts said, shuffling off into the kitchen. Belle wondered who babysat the baby cups during the dinner party. A nursemaid pitcher? Sighing at how crazy her life had become in the last few days, Belle tiredly, and stiffly too in her own way, headed up to her room. She held the balustrades tightly as she ascended the stairs, pulling herself along, deep in thought. In adventure books, there weren't awkward pauses or embarrassing social scenes. In morality plays and farces, there were rarely serious discussions of racial tension, mob mentality, pogroms, or plague. In scientific books, there was no dinner-time revelations of a terrible matter. Life is a strange mixture of all those genres, she mused, but it doesn't have nearly as neat and happy an ending as you often get in books. When she got to her room, the wardrobe was asleep, or very still. Belle undressed slowly and climbed into bed, head spinning with all she had learned. A kingdom at the end of its time, corrupt with evil and disease. A king and queen so removed they were as bad as Nero, literally doing nothing while their kingdom burned. A curse on an 11-year-old delivered by an enchantress, probably enraged by the treatment of her people, and angry with the neglect of the kingdom as a whole. But did the boy prince really deserve his fate? And here was Belle, who had hurried that unhappily ever after along, unless they found out what happened to her mother, or managed to find some equally powerful member of Les Charmans, the beast and his servants would be stuck that way forever, riding out the remainder of time in the forgotten castle in the middle of the woods. Magic always came back on itself. One last thought occurred to Belle before the sleep finally claimed her. What if, since her mother was the one who cast the spell, Belle was the only one who could break it?